The engineering of consent, also known as the manufacturing of consent, occurs when large-scale disinformation is utilized to convince the general public to think about something in a certain way. This social phenomenon has been studied throughout history by philosophers, psychologists, and sociologists alike. The determination by those who have studied the subject enough is that every society with a ruling class has always had some form or another of engineering consent, whether it be claiming that they have a God-given right to rule, insinuating that life would be so much worse without them, or inventing an enemy that only they can protect the people from. It can always be found. The purpose behind engineering consent is to sustain one's rule for as long as possible. Historically speaking, governments have not been for the people. Instead, they've been controlled by those who seek to obtain some sort of material gain for themselves at the expense of those they rule over. Without the engineering of consent, most populations would quickly realize that this is the case and revolt against the government in place. When the engineering of consent occurs, it's easy to identify from the outside but substantially more difficult to identify from the inside. People often identify other countries' misinformation quite easily, but whenever it's their own country, they tend to take this information at face value rather than challenging it as they would another country's claims. In this essay, I intend to identify the engineering of consent going on in the modern Western world by utilizing specific examples of it taking place, going through various methods of propaganda and proving that they're happening beyond any reasonable doubt. I am then going to connect those examples to capitalism on a larger scale to show that these are not isolated instances of it occurring, but rather an inescapable outcome of a system based on profits. The majority of the engineering of consent that takes place in the modern world is via the media. Media corporations are for-profit industries just like any other comparable corporation. Media-based corporations make their money not from selling information to consumers, but rather by selling consumers to advertisers. Their profits are not made from you purchasing their services, but through selling space or time on their product. They also rely heavily on government bailouts, subsidies, and tax breaks to remain profitable. Because of this, the media's three most frequent sources consist of corporations, which are largely comprised of their advertisers, the government, and supposed experts that have been approved by the previous two. So on this basis, it should be quite apparent that these institutions are able to control the narrative if they want to. For example, Jeff Bezos owns both Amazon and the Washington Post. There has also never been a negative article on Amazon published in the Washington Post. While each individual pundit at the Washington Post may be able to talk about whatever they please, up until a certain point, Jeff Bezos is simply not going to hire known Amazon critics. Instead, he's going to hire people whose work he's read before and agreed with. Generally speaking, people with the same worldview as him. In this way, the engineering of consent isn't necessarily a quid pro quo operation, but rather a byproduct of the market system. The first method of engineering consent I would like to posit is the suppression of information. An essential part of the engineering of consent is simply not stating the information that goes against the narrative ordained by corporations and the government. If people's only source of the news is media, and they trust the media implicitly to report what's important, when they don't, the knowledge never enters the public mind. This prevents any dissent from forming against corporations and the government even in the most extreme circumstances of blatant misconduct. If the vast majority of people don't know what's going on in the first place, they're unable to generate dissent over it. Take a local newspaper, for example. The company distributing the paper actually loses money selling it to its subscribers. It costs more in equipment, ink, labor, paper, and rent than the small amount that it's sold for brings in. Instead, the business model of the paper company is to sell portions of the paper to advertisers. What they do is fill the paper full of that week's advertisements and then fill whatever space is left around it with news. In this way, the amount of news is not determined by importance, but rather how many advertisers they have that week. The news is further controlled by the advertisers in the fact that the paper company needs the revenue to be profitable. If larger advertisers don't like what is being printed in the paper and pull their advertisements, the paper company could go out of business. So if, say, a local restaurant had reports of not being very hygienic, if the restaurant is a large source of the revenue of that paper company, they most likely wouldn't print this story. They also wouldn't be very likely to say anything negative about local government officials. If they did, those officials might vote to remove whatever corporate welfare they're currently receiving. This could cause the company to stop being profitable even with advertiser revenue. So, if these officials vote to pass a bill that isn't in the best interest of the residents in the area, they probably won't report on the bill at all. Or, if they do, they'll most likely make it not sound as bad as it actually is. A lot of the time, the interests of corporations and government even align, making it so that every source of their revenue wants something reported on in a specific way. Consider a local official who owns stock in a local restaurant that is in danger of being shut down due to hygienic concerns. If that official votes to lower hygiene standards for restaurants, This conflict of interest will most likely not be reported on. If they did, they would risk losing every source of revenue that they have. This same exact thing occurs on mainstream media platforms as well. Such an example of this is how no mainstream news outlet will openly acknowledge the absurdity of the American healthcare system and doesn't advocate for it being completely removed from the private sector, despite the fact that every country that has done this in some capacity has had nothing but good outcomes for the vast majority of the population. The reason they won't espouse such a view is for the simple fact that the health insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industry are two of the largest advertisers in the country. A similar instance of this occurring can be seen on the True TV television show Adam Ruins Everything. In the episode, Adam Ruins Everything, the host of the show admits that they had to cancel an episode where they ruin Gatorade by informing people how unhealthy it actually is, because Gatorade turned out to be one of the network's advertisers. They instead made the replacement episode about ruining myths on hydration in general and stayed away from the subject of Gatorade. While admitting to such a thing rarely happens in the media, it displayed that the show has at least some level of intellectual integrity. But it also shows that this sort of thing is out of the hands of those providing the information, and it's just how the system operates. The mainstream media also doesn't report on scandals that make the government look bad as a whole. They may report on one or two specific government officials, usually comprised of those whose platform goes against the interests of their advertisers, but never on the entire system as a whole. This can be seen time and time again in the fact that there are simply no reports, or at least almost no reports, in the American media on American war crimes. These American war crimes can be found in abundance in declassified government documents and foreign media, so with enough research, it's easy to find that they exist. Furthermore, such war crimes being excluded from the national conversation often serve the needs of both corporations and government. Defense contractors make huge amounts of money through the United States committing such war crimes, as it means that they have to purchase more bombs to do so. So if the public isn't aware of such war crimes taking place, they'll never be able to put pressure on the government officials to stop. Take the comparable instance of the murder of Jerzy Popieluszko in Poland. He was a religious leader and a well-known supporter of the Polish Solidarity movement. Poland is a United States ally, and the group responsible for his murder was an enemy of the United States. Around the same time, 22 religious leaders were murdered in Guatemala. The group that did these murders, however, were armed, funded, and trained by the United States government. If the suppression of information propaganda model stands, it should follow that the murder of the one Polish religious leader would have been reported on frequently, while the 22 Guatemalans would not have been, which through the examination of mainstream media airtime and articles done by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, which can be found in their co-authored book, Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media, it can be found that this is exactly what happened. In the New York Times, the murder of the one Polish religious leader was covered in 78 articles. Their combined coverage of the murdered 22 Guatemalans totaled 5 articles. In Times and News Weekly, the murder of the one Polish religious leader was covered in 16 articles. Their combined coverage of the 22 murdered Guatemalans totaled 0 articles. On CBS News, the murder of the one Polish religious leader was covered in 46 news programs. Their combined coverage of the 22 murdered Guatemalans totaled 0 news programs, which clearly shows that information is being reported on the basis of how it fits the narrative that corporations and government want to be presented. This can further be seen through the distortion of terminology which often takes place and which the media goes along with. The Right to Work Act, for example, states that corporations can fire employees for no reason without warning. The Patriot Act allows government agencies, such as the NSA, to spy on United States citizens without requiring a warrant, even in instances where they don't have probable cause. The Department of Defense also used to be named the Department of War, but it was changed in an attempt to make it seem as though the United States only engages in self-defense, never in preemptive attack, even though this is the exact opposite of what the United States has historically done. These distortions of terminologies have changed the way in which you think about things before you even engaged with the substance of what they are, therefore allowing the engineering of consent to be done passively. The second method of engineering consent I would like to posit is the illusion of dissent. A frequent tactic of engineering consent is to orchestrate scenarios that make it seem as though there is active critical thinking going on without actually presenting any information that would harm the system as a whole. This is done by generating debate on a subject within a specific spectrum of acceptable opinion. The spectrum assumes the presupposition of the system as being correct, and then generates debate within that framework. In doing so, the public unconsciously accepts the presupposition and orients their opinion on the basis of that range of discussion. The allowance of such free speech makes it seem as though the system is open to criticism, and therefore better for it, making it much more difficult to identify the fact that engineering of consent is taking place. Such discussion took place during the invasion of Vietnam. Pro-war pundits argued that the United States should continue to occupy Vietnam because of the threat of communism, while anti-war pundits argued that the United States should withdraw from Vietnam because it was costing too much and too little progress was being made. No one questioned what right the United States had to murder large swaths of civilian populations for the purpose of circumventing a country's right to self-determination. Both of the acceptable opinions on the subject leave the idea intact that the United States government has the right to impose its will on other countries at the expense of countless innocent lives, just that it might not want to because it's expensive to do so. Going back to the previous example of the American healthcare system, pundits will often debate the topic, but only within the context of how much subsidies it should give to healthcare companies. One side will vehemently argue that it's not the government's responsibility to pay for your healthcare, while the other side will equally vehemently argue that the government should cover a percentage of the costs of people's healthcare on the basis of how much they could afford. Regardless of the outcome of such a debate, the healthcare system wins. Either it ends up as being people paying the corporations out of pocket, or people paying the corporations with their tax dollars. None of the pundits would go so far as to say that the for-profit healthcare system shouldn't exist and that such a fundamental need should be addressed outside of the capitalist paradigm. In fact, all matters of how to improve conditions in the mainstream media are framed within the assumption that capitalism is inarguably the best possible system. Never does anyone question the premise. Debates on the subject are simply matters of what type of capitalism should exist. Such exclusion of other systems from the range of discussion makes it seem as though one would have to be an ignoramus to even consider the possibility of an alternative. Thus, people have an automatic apprehension or embarrassment when these ideas do occur to them, and therefore rarely become properly thought out or voiced. This also allows people on either side of the acceptable spectrum to appear as though they're vastly different in terms of opinion when in all actuality, they only maintain minor differences. This can be seen in the way that the mainstream media portrays Democrats and Republicans as being polar opposites when in fact their platforms are often almost identical copies. During Donald Trump's first term in office, Democrats voted in favor of his policies over 80% of the time. This included the border wall, increased military budget, tariffs on China, and tax breaks for the rich. None of these policies did Joe Biden even attempt to repeal during his time in office. In fact, even after Donald Trump's border wall had already been halted, Joe Biden ordered the construction to be resumed immediately, the border wall being the same one that he had argued against so passionately just a few short years prior, clearly displaying that his apparent criticisms of the wall were just for show, creating the facade of being a dissident, and that he actually agreed with it all along. The apparent differences between Democrats and Republicans seem to only be in regards to issues like abortion access, gun control, immigration, LGBTQ+ rights, and religion in schools, focusing the vast majority of public debates between each other on these topics to appear as though they disagree much more than they actually do, while variations on economic, military, regulation, tax, and trade policy is nearly non-existent. Every 4 to 8 years, one side gets to look like the resistance to the status quo. This is until they get themselves back into power and then they become the upholders of the status quo, and the other side gets to act the part of dissidents for another 4 to 8 years. And then the cycle continues, and all the while nothing really ever changes. The third form of engineering consent that I would like to posit is the deflection of blame. Engineering consent usually requires some sort of enemy to exist. People know that things are bad. They can see that they don't have enough food to eat, or enough money to make ends meet. So the ruling class must present some sort of opposition other than themselves that these circumstances can be blamed on. The enemy is usually oriented on the basis of either ethnicity, gender, nationality, race, religion, sexuality, or a combination of those. But this enemy can take other forms as well. In Nazi Germany, the enemy consisted of the disabled, homosexuals, Jews, and other minorities, demonizing these groups of people as the cause of everyone's financial hardships, attacking them to the point where they were so despised that the majority of people sat idly by as they were hauled off into concentration camps. During the same period of time, the enemy in the United States was Japanese Americans. While simultaneously criticizing Germany for its use of camps on minority populations, the United States government did the same exact thing to those of Japanese descent, instead opting to call them internment camps rather than concentration camps. The claim that the United States did this for any other reason than to create opposition through racism is absurd. If this wasn't the case, then the white German Americans would have also been hauled away into these camps, not just the Asian Japanese Americans. The United States has also always used racism against African Americans and Hispanic Americans as the hallmark scapegoat, convincing people that poor black families on welfare and illegal immigrants stealing the good jobs are the reason why everyone is so poor. But this is clearly an obfuscation from reality. The minuscule amount of money that either of these groups makes from their respective supposed theft is nothing compared to the yearly payout of taxpayer subsidies to corporations, which exceeds the entire annual deficit. The largest banks in the United States aren't even profitable without taxpayer subsidies. The $83 billion that they report each year in profits is exactly equal to the $83 billion they receive each year in taxpayer subsidies, Essentially, this is a transfer of taxpayer money to corporate shareholders, a policy that banks spend hundreds of millions of dollars each election cycle to convince politicians to preserve. Such is a clear theft that eclipses any small amount of money that poor people receive in order to make sure that they don't starve to death while working to produce for someone who is siphoning away all of their money. As President Lyndon Johnson had once said to one of his aides, quote, "If you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you." End quote. As long as the ruling class is able to keep the oppressed in opposition with each other, they'll completely ignore the actual enemy who's making their lives miserable. Even in instances where the demonized group isn't being blamed for financial reasons, the ruling class knows that putting the spotlight on them draws the attention away from themselves. This can be seen in the fact that immigrant crime is covered more often than white citizen crime, despite the fact that the crime rate of immigrants is significantly lower. The fear-mongering about the immigrant community makes it far easier to blame them for other problems as well, effectively drawing attention to them and away from the ruling class. This can also be seen in things like debates over whether gay people should be able to adopt children, or things like transgendered individuals being able to compete in the sports of the gender they identify as. Effectively, all studies ever produced have shown that having gay parents does nothing to prohibit development in any way, shape, or form. It is simply a tactic to generate homophobia in an attempt to keep people's minds occupied. The same thing can also be said for generating transphobia through the transgender sports debates. Only a study's shown that after 2 years of taking hormone replacement therapy, essentially all of the genetic advantages that could be used in sports seem to disappear. But less than 1% of the population actually even identifies as transgender. And even then, the percentage of trans people who actually want to and have the athletic ability to compete against cisgendered professional athletes is an even smaller subsection of the population. Yet, stories such as these have a tendency to take up a considerable amount of coverage time within the media, constantly flooding the airways with a bunch of random nonsense and attempting to upset people with it, hence keeping their mind focused on problems that aren't really problems at all, creating an uproar for things that either don't exist or only exist in such tiny quantities as to where it's irrelevant to the majority of people's everyday lives to begin with, all the while distracting them and taking up headspace from the actual problems they're facing and who is actually responsible for them. The fourth form of engineering consent that I would like to posit is the indoctrination of education. The engineering of one's consent is a process that takes place from birth onward. In order to ingrain individuals with certain biases and beliefs, a form of indoctrination is presented through the facade of education. Each of the previous methods of propaganda are used for this form of engineering consent and can be found throughout the entirety of nearly any capitalist country's education system. In the United States, many aspects of the country's questionable history are completely ignored or glanced over as insignificant outliers. George Washington is praised as being a hero despite the American horrors in which he played a large role in. He is known to have ordered the slaughter of countless Native Americans and himself owned and perpetuated the ownership of slaves. These facts are largely set aside, however, in favor of presenting out-of-context details about his life that make him seem like a much more virtuous person. Furthermore, while facts of American history such as the attempted genocide of the Native Americans, the conquering of Mexican territory, the placement of Japanese Americans in camps, and segregation and slavery are discussed, they are given very little time in the actual curriculum despite accounting for the vast majority of American history. And when the subjects are brought up, they are made to seem as much less severe than they actually were. At the same time, many other aspects of American history are completely ignored outright. This being the vast majority of American imperialism in which the subject is never broached in the American educational system. The invasion of countries throughout Africa, Asia, and South America are simply excluded from the American curriculum. The argument also can't be made that the exclusion has anything to do with not wanting to present such violent occurrences to students. This can be seen in the fact that many parts of America's violent history are presented, but only the ones where America is made to look good when viewed through a certain lens. This includes the often discussed Civil War, where it's insinuated that the Union Army sacrificed their lives to put an end to slavery, or World War II, when it's indicated that the United States government saved millions of people from concentration camps. Even these historical occurrences that are presented, the majority of information about them is excluded in order to allow them to be seen as better than they are. It's rarely talked about that the Civil War was fought for economic reasons, not out of care for the slaves. Abraham Lincoln even stated during that time period that he didn't believe that black people should be equal to white people, and the Emancipation Proclamation he signed into law only freed slaves in the South, where it was known that they wouldn't obey as they had already seceded, not in the North. During World War II, the United States had also committed various egregious atrocities that are never brought up, such as the fact that the majority of the bombings were aimed at concentration camps, killing the very same people who they were supposedly saving, and working-class communities, killing people who had nothing to do with the war at all. Or the fact that World War II couldn't have even happened in the first place if it wasn't for the United States supplying Germany and Japan with oil, These countries' natural oil reserves were so low that they would never have been able to run so many jets and tanks otherwise, but the United States had to allow its corporations to profit off of the war from both sides. The educational system then makes it seem as though pointing out such facts makes you a bad person, painting those who do it as unpatriotic or a traitor to their country. This is done as a tactic to prevent dissidents, causing people to blindly believe whatever their country tells them and accept that even the worst atrocities they commit are somehow in the best interest of the greater good. In all actuality, if being a patriot means separating yourself from the facts of reality, then it's the ultimate form of engineering consent, as it literally causes people to do the work for them. One of the most notable identifiers of a cult is known to be a group of people monotone chanting at a symbolic idol. Yet this is exactly what the United States government mandates that every child do every single morning. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. An oath that I will forever have memorized due to my own indoctrination as a child. I hope that you enjoyed this video essay on the engineering of consent. Please consider following for more. Thank you.